Welcome to another episode of Inside the Mavs, the official Mavericks podcast of 97.1 The Freak. I'm your host, Kevin Gray, along with my partner, Grant Afseth of Mavs Sports Illustrated, covering all things for the Dallas Mavericks. Really appreciate you joining us on iHeart Podcast or wherever you get your podcasts for free. You can download and subscribe where you get those podcasts for free, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports. You can find Grant on Twitter at Grant Afseth. Of course, I'm your Mavs pre- and post host on the Dallas Mavericks Radio Network. Grant doing his thing on the beat, covering the Mavericks for Sports Illustrated. Got a lot to get into today's episode. Remember, episodes drop every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, so make sure you subscribe so that you can get the notification on when the podcast drops. You can also watch it on YouTube as well. You can watch it on my YouTube channel at Kevin Gray Sports or on Grant's channel at Grant Afseth, where we have all of our podcast episodes available for both download, to watch, and also for you to listen wherever you get your podcast. Before I go any further, want to say what's up to my partner, Grant. Good to see you, man. How are you?
I'm doing pretty well. I'm glad to do another episode with you. It's definitely a lot to talk about with that crazy, historic 30-0 run for sure.
Yeah, a lot to get into with that. The Mavericks, of course, going on a historic 30-0 run in the game against the Oklahoma City Thunder on Saturday night. Unfortunately, though, the Thunder come back with a 13-3 run of their own to end the game to win 126-120. Mavericks, of course, now have lost 5 of their last 7 games, having lost the second night of a back-to-back after losing to Memphis on Friday night. Luka was back with a tremendous triple-double, but unfortunately, it was not enough in the end to end the losing streak, as the Mavericks are off until Wednesday when they get ready to take on the Utah Jazz. Of course, the rest of the NBA, or I guess say a good portion of the NBA, or I don't even want to call it that. There's a bunch of teams that are not playing in the in-season tournament. There are some teams that are playing in the in-season tournament in Vegas. Unfortunately, the Mavericks, not one of those teams, traveling to Sin City to participate in the inaugural in-season tournament. But let's start with the game on Saturday. You mentioned it, Grant. The talking point coming out of that game, Mavericks go on a 30-0 run after being down by as many as 24 points in the fourth quarter. What stood out to you with that historic run that they went on, a franchise record 30-0 run, to help them get back into the game? I guess we need to start with how they got into a 24-point deficit going into that historic run, which was 30-0 there.
Yeah, I think a lot of that initial period where they kind of dug that 24-point hole, as you mentioned, has a lot to do with the fact that they were trying to get the ball at Shai Gilgeous-Alexander's hands pretty frequently. They were trying to blitz him, make the Thunder play out of that 4-on-3, like other teams like to make Luka and the Mavs play out of those short rolls. And it's very challenging to execute and be on a string against a Thunder team that's got a lot of talent, like Chet Holmgren being a beneficiary on that short roll often. And then you have a lot of like just perimeter threats that can get, put the ball on the floor, get in the paint, and make some plays. So that, I think that poses a lot of challenges in general, and that's a lot to really execute throughout a full game. That even seeped into that post-run period of the game to close it out. That became a problem where I guess you could say the seams kind of just broke, and they couldn't really quite get stops executing out of that defense trying to get the ball out of SGA's hands. So I think just there's a lot to take away from that, where they still have to really fine tune how they're approaching that. And then I think in general, there was a lot of players out of the lineup, so that adds complication as well. And then also Luka was back in the lineup, and he admitted to having some, I guess you could say, an empty gas tank, if you will, towards the end of that game, and
Sure.
that kind of contributes when you're trying to execute out of that type of defense. So I think, as they kind of settle back into having players hopefully back in the lineup on a more consistent basis, they can work on those like second, third, fourth rotations in the half court to really get down, taking the ball out of a superstar's hands. Because that's been a problem for them at times this season, where they really try to load up on a dynamic talent, and then they don't really like make those extra rotations and close the play on the glass. So that was definitely something that stood out against one of those better teams in the Western Conference.
Yeah, among others, no Tim Hardaway Jr., as he's dealing with back spasms. He was back at practice on Monday. Kyrie Irving, as he's been dealing with a foot sprain, he was also back at practice on Monday. So good news there on the injury front. When it comes to the Mavericks, we'll touch on a little bit more in terms of that injury front when it comes to Josh Green a little bit later on, but you could tell it was the Luka Doncic show really from the entire beginning of the word go, because while, yes, the Mavericks were shorthanded, he wound up playing the entirety of the second half against the Oklahoma City Thunder in terms of the comeback. And at one point, the Mavericks turned around what was a 24-point deficit into a 6-point lead to be able to, what it felt like, complete the comeback and win the game. They ran out of gas down the stretch, but there were some good moments, I thought, in that particular fourth quarter, namely a guy in A.J. Lawson who is starting to get a few more opportunities with this team, and you were able to see what he was able to do, knocking down a couple of threes, making some impact plays in that fourth quarter, and they needed him because, and we'll maybe touch on this too, Grant Williams has not played well over the last 4 or 5 ball games, and he was non-existent again in this game against the Oklahoma City Thunder, where they needed a guy like A.J. Lawson to step up and really help them at least get to the point where they were able to get the 6-point lead, ultimately falling short, though, to the Thunder in that way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think throughout that game, there was moments where Luka had that ball forced out of his hands with blitzing, and they really need someone one pass away to knock down a shot or just make a play in general with it popping around. And Lawson stepped up quite a bit at times. He had 3 threes in that game. And that was a night where, without Tim Hardaway Jr., especially, who's been one of the high volume shot makers from 3 in the NBA alongside Luka, if the ball's getting forced out of the other high volume makers' hands, you got to have someone on the other end of it to make the defense pay. So with him being out, someone like Lawson stepping up definitely makes a big difference. And, there's always been a lot to like, I feel like, about Lawson's game. He really makes a lot of effort defensively, whether he's in Frisco, whether he's playing on Summer League in Vegas. He swarms around the half court. He's very quick. And, he can do a little bit of putting the ball on the floor to attack closeouts. He's always been a very active cutter, a very active transition player on leakouts as well. But I think, something that I've always kind of kept tabs on him with is that, he's very thin. So, ideally to be able to guard multiple positions, you would like to see him add, size to his frame. And, I remember asking him about that in Vegas about where's your current situation? Have you been able to add weight? Is that an emphasis for you? And he did mention that, it's hard for him to put on weight, but he's been working on that. So I think, even beyond that, just in general, his general 3-and-D skill set with that athleticism, whether he's got the ideal frame or not, definitely is an intriguing set of skills to have especially when you have a player like Luka, who you need those floor spacing threats, you need versatility defensively. And to be honest, for a team that's got a lot of small players that plays a lot of small perimeter lineups, I don't think Lawson's frame looks that out of place. You know what I mean? Because they're just got a big perimeter anyways. So I guess that definitely adds to it as well, where he's not really taking away size on this team by any stretch. So I think he'll be an interesting player to watch as they have to give opportunities, at times throughout the season to guys when injuries start to pile up like they did.
Yeah, 12 points in the game for Lawson, 9 in that fourth quarter as the Mavericks scored 36 in the period, while holding the Thunder to 19. Ultimately, though, they were not able to get the win. But at the same time, and I want to touch on it because, I mentioned Grant Williams in the game only had 5 points, and his shooting struggles continue over the last several games as well. And with the injuries that are piling up for this team, and we'll get into Josh Green here in a minute, they're going to need Grant Williams to start stepping up a little bit more. He got out to the really hot start to the season, where at one point he was shooting over 50% from the three-point line. But in the last several games, the shot has not fallen. And defensively, while there have been flashes, there really hasn't been much positivity from Grant Williams in that way. What do you think you're seeing when it comes to Grant Williams and why he may be struggling a little bit there?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of what you said with the a lot of reliance on the 3-point shot. It kind of reminds me of what we talked about with Josh Green on recent episodes when he was really struggling. A lot of that, like a huge percentage of his shot attempts are going to be, from 3. And when those aren't falling, that takes away opportunities to start putting it on the floor after you draw those tighter closeouts, and teams kind of react to your second make in a game and, things like that. So I think a lot of things flow through that 3-point shot, falling. but also teams after, like, I guess around, you could say 10 games, around a dozen games, they start to really hone in on tendencies. I mean, he entered in the season as like a high reputation shooter. So it's not like teams realized, oh, Grant Williams can shoot the three. But, when you're on a team that's really overwhelmingly like effective from three, they've got to take away that production somewhere. So I think, it's just the continuation of getting comfortable in that larger role, I think could be a part of it, where he's on a team where the Mavericks aren't going to be able to just be like, all right, well, you're going to go on the bench. We have a very deep rotation like the Boston Celtics were able to do in the playoffs last year. So I think he's going to have to work through those elements and continue to build upon attacking closeouts and just finding different ways to make plays. Because there's times where he's getting stuck under the rim, in the paint in general, where he's not really the most effective like driving threat and off the dribble player. So I think just finding that fine line of attacking closeouts to make the defense pay, but then making that the proper decision when you do get downhill, I think is a big part of it. Because it's one thing to miss shots, it's another to start like putting on the floor and missing inside the paint and like turning it over. So I think that's one part of it as well. But I think another part of it on the other side of the ball with his defense, I think there's been times where, when they kind of keep it in the half court and he's able to be more positional, where he's getting vertical and like walling up an offensive player as the defender, that's been effective. But I think the swarming and really trying to, make those extra rotations, that's naturally, I think, going to be challenging for him since he's kind of a bigger frame guy. He's not the quickest, athlete out there, especially laterally. Like if he's going to have to like close the gap and then slide laterally and cut someone off and like be persistent with it, I think he's going to struggle with that. So I think overall, it's kind of also adjusting to how the Mavericks want to defend as well. Like if they really feel they need to gap up on a really talented player and make all those rotations and really swarm, then that's something that Grant Williams will definitely have to continue to get comfortable in and I guess you could say refine how he's doing it, because I think that's where there's been some limitations for sure.
And one of the interesting things that Grant Williams has talked about too, and he's talked about it now on a couple of occasions, is that, from a body language standpoint, making sure that he is staying locked in, on the defensive end when it comes to not only the leadership and the communication that he's got to help his team be able to display on each and every possession. But one thing that kind of bothered me that I heard, and you've heard it from this team in years past, particularly over the last couple of years, and Jason Kidd has said it as much as well, is that when shots aren't falling for them, things tend to go awry for them defensively. And one thing Grant Williams said in a recent post-game press conference is, we cannot allow our missed shots or inability to score at times affect the way that we play on the defensive end. And I thought to myself, I've heard that before, and I didn't like hearing it then just as much as I don't like hearing it now. It's something that we really shouldn't be talking about when it comes to this team, is that the offensive energy dictating how they play on the defensive end, because normally you would want the defensive energy that you create in getting stops, being able to have multiple possessions where you're getting stops to feed what you're doing offensively, especially getting out of transition the way that this team has been able to do so far this year. You want that to be the way that you are able to generate energy, communication, all those things that go along in terms of having your offensive game go. I don't like the fact that I'm hearing yet from another Maverick, this time a newer one, that, hey, man, we can't allow our defensive energy be dictated by whether or not we're making shots in that way. I didn't necessarily like it. I want your thoughts on that too.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because this is a team that obviously is a very like prolific offensive team. They usually are going to be elite in a lot of categories, especially three-point shooting and just general half-court efficiency. So if you're going to have the benefit of Luka Doncic to kind of set the table there, you got to have an identity where you're setting the table defensively. And I think that's been definitely a drawback since that Western Conference Finals run with the team. Even during that time, I feel like they made comments about it. But, overall, like that's where you kind of have to have an interjection of players, I feel like, that are kind of youthful and like provide that energy, like Dereck Lively, who are going to, be passionate about doing the dirty work no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, honestly, in a weird way, it gets kind of complicated when you have too many veterans. Or, I mean, I know Grant Williams is not the oldest player. Like he's 24 or 25 now to be calling like a veteran, but he's been around the NBA for a good amount of time. When you have I feel like when you have too many of those players are like around 30 years old, a little older than him, I feel like in a way you do end up having those like kind of going to the motion situations where shots not falling kind of results in that sort of that situation where you're talking about, where you're kind of living and dying by your offensive results, and kind of, I guess you could say, moping in a way, or like kind of
Sure.
not really fully locked in defensively. But overall, like, I would hope that with a rim protector that they've wanted for the last couple of years, that really takes pride, no matter what the game situation is, in playing hard, that they could get inspiration from that. And then also maybe the interjection of some of those younger players, especially players that are trying to, vie for contracts. Like AJ Lawson is going to be aggressive, swarming around the half court. And you kind of need to have that balance, I think, of having players that need to, have that motivation for themselves and the team collectively. Like, I guess you could say a little sense of desperation in a way, where you're really earning your place in the NBA, but not fully to that extent. Even like a Omax Prosper, ideally, that's why you'd hope that someone like that can continue to develop as well, because he's trying to find his place in the NBA, even though his contract, obviously like a rookie deal instead of that two-way. So I think, that's probably why you need to have that mix of players, because I think you can get too comfortable in kind of just, the big picture. As a veteran, I know that every game, doesn't like truly like live and die by the result throughout an 82 game season, and then we're vying for the playoffs. But if you do that too much, you might not even find yourself in the playoffs like last year,
Yeah.
where you're in that position. So I think overall, it's definitely not a great mentality to kind of hear, and they got to really work on that for sure. Because you would hope by now, with some of that interjection of different perspectives, that they would kind of snap out of that a little bit. But I guess that part of that's a little bit of human nature as well, as you've been around the NBA for a little while, for sure.
And Grant Williams, I think, is supposed to be a guy that's a part of that culture change when it comes to when things aren't happening, well offensively. Got to stay locked in, got to stay communicating. Rotations still have to be there to defend these teams, because these teams are as good as they are offensively. You cannot take possessions off. Otherwise, you find yourself getting down by 24 points to the Oklahoma City Thunder and having to go on a historic 30-0 run to find yourself getting back into the ball game. And you mentioned a guy who's got that youthful energy, and you saw that on full display in the game, on Saturday. Dereck Lively II goes for 20 points, 16 rebounds. My man had 7 blocks in the game and didn't miss a single shot, going 9 of 9 from the field. We've talked about him before, and we'll continue to talk about him because of how well he's played so far. But it just shows you how much of a steal, number one, this kid was for the Mavericks to be able to get him where they got him. But two, it gives you a really good idea of what this kid can be going into the future. And we've seen that in several instances. This was by far his best game as a pro so far in the league. And what he's been able to do on both ends of the floor, I think really, really excites Mavericks fans about what he can be able to do. First rookie in NBA history to ever, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe the first player in NBA history to go for 2016 and 7 and not miss a single shot in the process. Dereck Lively has been fantastic, and he was yet on display again against the Thunder on Saturday night for the Mavericks in that way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of things that were very intriguing about it too is just the way he is receptive to coaching. Like, in the post game interviews, they mentioned that, like, on those short rolls, when Luka's getting blitzed and the ball, finds a short roller, which is Lively in that situation, instead of just always kind of like being wired to look for the pass, they told him to attack the effing
be
basket,
more aggressive.
Yeah, be more aggressive. Yeah, so he said, "Oh, okay, well, I'm gonna just take this ball and dunk on Chet Holmgren, who's rotating over as the low man."
That's a great example. Yeah.
Yeah, you could not get that from like not like to throw anyone under the bus, but you can't get that, like the physical aspect of that does not come from like a Dwight Powell, a Maxi Kleber. They're going to be wired to make that pass out of just pure necessity, because they're not explosive players like that in that regard. So having a player like Lively who has those intangibles and the coachability is a great combination, and just shows you how dangerous a team can even be reaching that next level offensively when Luka is getting blitzed, they're playing 4-on-3, and they have that threat that can, really punish the middle of the defense, but then also has that vision and that passing ability to make those reads. Because that's something that we even talked about before Lively was a Maverick, way many months ago with, Raphael Barlow. He was mentioning, the prowess that Lively has with the short roll reads, and him becoming more aggressive as he goes along. That could be another fascinating development to see. And just overall, like the 7 blocks, like he was very active, and he's continuing to get his timing down as a, paint protector. making those rotations. And we're still in the early stages, as we mentioned, of them really getting into the, nuances of their coverages. Like there's only so much mixing up you're going to do in a game when, the rookie player is still 20. Like we haven't hit 20 games. Actually, next game should be, I think, the 20 mark.
20 games,
so
yeah.
That's a lot of progression from one 19-year-old in this amount of time. And it's kind of amazing to think about because, it does help to have superstar talents around him to, make the most of his skill set. But regardless, he's capitalizing on so much of the opportunity and expanding upon what he's doing. And it all starts with just the embrace of, as we've said, he understands his role from day one. He embraces it, works on the little details that he's got to work on both sides of the ball, continues to embrace it. And I thought it was actually interesting. I'm actually writing about this, particularly about the short rolls. I did talk to Dereck before in the locker room of that Pistons preseason finale, where, I was asking him about like anything that he's looking to continue to build upon as he enters the season. And he emphasized, playing out of flashes, putting the ball on the floor and being aggressive, more offensive minded, as he called it. So I think, seeing like kind of tracking his development and getting his thoughts at that time and then seeing it almost 20 games in now, that's pretty fascinating because, that mindset is growing, to be more offensive minded, and the impact is really getting there as well. And it's interesting to hear Luka encourage him to do it, Jason Kidd encourage him to do it. And I'm sure the things that we don't hear, other players are probably encouraging him to do it as well. But then seeing him be like, oh, okay, I'll go apply it, and it's that easy for him. That's fascinating to watch, and that's definitely a very intriguing thing about his development long term with the Mavs.
It's interesting because he feels like a superhero learning how to utilize and understand his superpowers. Like you'll see him at times and make mistakes, but he seems like a guy that doesn't make the same mistake necessarily twice. And you see with superheroes, they learn how to discover what they can do, how to harness their powers, and then be able to start using for good. It feels like that's where Dereck Lively is that he's learning, okay, I can do this. Let me see how much more I can do, and then be able to harness it to be able to help contribute as a rim protector and a shot blocker. I can be more aggressive out of short rolls and be able to get to the basket and put one on Chet Holmgren's head. Okay, I can start doing that a little bit more. Like he feels like a young kid who's just discovering who he is. And I think that's part of the encouraging growth is he's just beginning here. And I was talking to someone the other day about it. I said, look, just wait until Lively figures it out. Once he figures it out, and if he's doing some of these things already, it's going to be scary hours for the rest of the league. And he was under consideration, for Western Conference Rookie of the Month. Chet Holmgren wound up winning that, for the West, for the month of November. But it just shows you the progress that Lively is making. And for Mavericks fans, I think that was another huge takeaway from that game on Saturday night on what he's been able to do and continue to grow going forward there for sure.
Yeah, definitely. And I think overall, when you look back to last season's roster, a lot of times the lack of a defensive presence was pretty clear. And so seeing him back in the lineup after having, some game action under his belt after missing that game in LA, due to the back, injury that he had, I think we got to see him be comfortable once again and kind of in rhythm, in shape, everything like that.
There's a stark difference between when he is and when he's not in the lineup. Stark difference for sure.
Yeah, and that's crazy to think, and that's exactly what you want from a lottery pick that's like basically getting close to the quarter mark of the season. It's just wild to think like we entered the situation where people were thinking like I remember hearing like people talk about it on other podcasts and stuff, like he might end up starting the season in Frisco. Like it's crazy to think that like the progression he's made during the times, even when there's not like game action to like get film and like really like pick apart your own mistakes and approaches. The fact that he made that leap in like before training camp, continue to build on it. And it's actually kind of interesting. You said scary hours. That's how Luka described it as well too. So you guys are on the same page. Two people very high on Dereck Lively, Luka Doncic and Kevin Gray for sure.
I mean, he's proven so far to be a young man with a lot of maturity for being a 19-year-old and understanding, as you were mentioning, the kind of role that he has on this team and continue to grow and develop in that. Dereck Lively, I thought, was fantastic in the game against the Thunder. Derrick Jones Jr., another guy, he hit 6 threes, had 24 points in the game. He was really good as well. I mean, and it gets us to the idea of Josh Green here because Josh Green, he missed the game as he's been dealing with a little bit of injury as well. So where is Josh Green in your mind? We've seen flashes from him so far this year. Of course, he got the, rookie extension, before the season started. Where are you with Josh Green when it comes to his role on this team? I've said that he needs to be a starter, but at times Derrick Jones Jr. has played better than he has. When Green's had opportunity, he's played well. Where are you on the Josh Green experiment when it comes to he and the Dallas Mavericks at this point, especially now knowing he's dealing with the injury? We may not know when he's going to be returning for this team.
Yeah, I definitely think it's definitely an ongoing process for his development and growing comfort level. He's definitely been more effective, I feel like, or at least his approach has been more natural when there's been one of the stars out of the lineup. They've been able to run more actions for him, get him the ball in a position where he's just turning the corner and being aggressive, exploding to the rim, or just making a pass out like he did a couple games ago, with Kyrie against Memphis. As the focus, he was able to get downhill kind of early in that game and then make pass outs. But then you get into a situation where if the ball is popping around and it's kind of finding the 3-point line too much, you're relying too much on the shot falling. So I think for him, kind of building on what we said in the past, continuing to be more aggressive on those drives to look for himself to score, whether it's finishing at the rim, playing through contact, or getting into a short range jump shot, is definitely a big layer of impact that he could add to his game. And we haven't really seen it on a consistent basis yet. I think part of that has to do with not trying to do too much. Sometimes teams are analytically driven where they want certain players taking certain shots and others to kind of make that pass. I'm not saying that's the case in this instance. I truthfully don't know because we're not in the coaching meetings by any stretch. But, just in general, I think finding however it may be, that comfort level with not relying too much on the three, because he has the intangibles to be able to get into other things. And whether that's the team just kind of, getting into more of those actions when both stars are in the lineup, or just during those staggered, playing time opportunities with different lineups, I think that could be a good way to kind of keep him engaged offensively. But I do think, within the flow, you'd like to see him naturally find his way more, be more aggressive, whether they're running a set for him or not. And I think that's kind of where we've fallen in the situation, is when he's not doing that, he's relying a lot on the three. And when the three's not falling or not finding him, then you have a lot of low scoring production nights where, I guess the message that they've sent, in pregame a couple games ago, Jason Kidd did describe his performance against the Wizards, where he went scoreless, as his best game of the season. So I guess it's also important to kind of put into context what the team is asking for him. And if that's how they view his performance, then I guess the scoring is not a big deal. So overall, you're going to have to set the tone somewhere else, which would be, as we've discussed, the on-ball defense. He's got to really find a way to, I guess you could say, maximize his approach as an on-ball defender against tough assignments, get through screens, really maximize how he's doing everything in his approach on that end, and kind of find himself through that defensive identity. And I guess in a way that kind of ties into our previous element of this conversation, where we talked about not allowing offense to basically fester, or defense, or shot making to fester into the defensive execution. He's one of those energy guys that will play very hard, high point, really tough long rebounds. He just flies into the middle of the paint, grabs a rebound. He does things that other players aren't capable of doing. So if he can kind of find his way, get comfortable, I agree with what you say. In the long run, ideally, you would like to have him emerge and have those traits be, more prevalent for that 30 minutes per game where he's playing alongside in the most impactful moments. But until he kind of establishes that comfort level with being aggressive, looking to score within the flow, and also really takes that next step defensively, I think we're going to be in a situation where it's, I guess you could say, riding the hot hand, if you will. I know Derrick Jones set a career high and made threes, so that's literally the hot hand.
Right.
But in general, the more trustworthy option for the coaching staff could be, Derrick Jones, because I remember, Jason Kidd had an element or an impact on him coming to the Mavs, that he mentioned a conversation with Kidd as the reason why he joined the team, understood his responsibilities before he got here. And so there's naturally, I believe, a trust there. So I think, Green has to be that much better overall to be able to really, I guess you could say, take the reins of that starting wing spot. So that's just a lot of nuance and layers to it, but definitely it's a work in progress at the moment.
Yeah, because the Mavericks are going to need him. And for Josh Green, if this team doesn't go out and try to trade for a bigger athletic wing, when it comes to the trade deadline. They're going to need Derrick Jones Jr. They're going to need Josh Green to really be stabilizing forces in terms of their perimeter defense, because they have, between the two of them, enough athleticism where you would think they would be plus defenders to be able to handle some of these guys that they're going to be dealing with, in terms of their abilities to get downhill and get to the basket, because that was one thing against Memphis, going back to the game on Friday night, where Desmond Bane had his way and getting into the paint whenever he wanted to. There were too many easy baskets that were given up in that game, and in a lot of ways in the game against the Thunder as well, to help them build that 24-point lead. Now, granted, Jalen Williams was shooting the three ball out of his mind in that game against the Dallas Mavericks, where I think coming into the game, Williams was 8 for his previous 28 from the three-point line, and he then decided to go off against the Mavericks, from downtown. So you had an anomaly there in terms of his three-point shooting. But the point being, you've got to have athletic wings that can defend and knock down shots, especially if you're going to play alongside Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. And I want to make sure I give Luka his flowers too, because he took the challenge defensively, especially as you got later into the game, had a couple of steals, was able to make some things happen defensively, and you could see the effort that he's putting in. And Jason Kidd saying, look, man, we got to recognize what Luka's doing on that end as well. He's never going to be an all-world, all-NBA defender, Luka Doncic. No one's ever going to accuse him of that. But he's always going to be, it appears going forward, a guy's going to give enough effort on the end to where guys have got to respect it to be able to recognize what he's doing. I say that to say Josh Green, Derrick Jones Jr., and others have got to take on a similar mentality with giving not just effort, but competent effort to be able to help this Mavericks team. Because right now, this is a team that's 25th in the NBA in defensive rating. That's not going to cut it with a team that's as good as they are in terms of a top 10 offensive rating team, 9th in pace right now. They're doing a lot of good things offensively. They still got to find their way a little bit defensively right now as well.
Yeah, and I think it puts a lot of pressure on Luka as well, where if you're not able to completely cover him up defensively, he's going to have to play so many minutes in general that, like, there was some plays at the very, very end after he had those stretches that you described of his, like, effective defense, where I think he just didn't have enough left in the tank. And he admitted that he was tired after the game because, playing the whole second half, that's after missing a game, that's really tough.
For the birth of his daughter, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, like, having that I think he allowed that drive late in the game where, like, he basically just got beat on the perimeter. And, that's going to happen when you're playing, like, as you said, like the 46 something minutes, like 45. Yeah. That's a lot of playing time. So,
46
overall,
minutes.
I guess everything kind of ties into itself, where it's like, you have to be able to sustain that level of energy by making the game easier and not having to rely on Luka playing that much to be able to have that fighting chance, like to allow him to, sit for a couple minutes. And that also ties into, the in and out nature of, I guess, some of the stretches of the season so far for the superstar duo, like with Kyrie being out. You're not going to have that luxury of having the superstar be able to, kind of run the show for the stretch where Luka was able to get some energy and kind of get back, before coming in. And I think overall, that's where you'd like those other players to kind of find a way to step up within the flow and be more trustworthy, if you will. And I think that also has to do with Jaden Hardy as well, because he had some tough defensive plays in that third quarter. He fouled Davis Bertans on a three-point shot. The defense overall lost him in the corner. Like, that's a guy you guys played with. Like you have to know you can't.
There's one thing you can't do with Davis.
Yeah,
you can't leave him open.
Yeah, he's gonna knock shots down. And if
if
you've seen teams top locking him and just chasing him around the half court just for after he checks in, you can't be the team that played with him and then leaves him wide open in the corner. That's not how you get back in the game. So I think when you kind of have one of your creators like Jaden Hardy, his development is very crucial for those nights, because you would need him to be able to step into that role where you really trust him to get the offense going. And that's where not having Dante Exum was really a negatively impactful thing, because you lose a versatile wing defender. But if you notice also, a lot of times Jason Kidd highlights the trustworthiness he has in Exum to run the offense and get them into their actions and things like that. So I think that's where you like to see Jaden Hardy be able to grow, continue to become more efficient in those aspects overall. And then maybe, Luka could have sat for more time and had more energy to close the game. So I think there's just a lot of things that go into one game and moments throughout a game. that I think are important to think about with the team going forward. And hopefully, it starts with superstars being able to, be available. Obviously, Luka had a great reason to not play the game that he
Sure.
missed. But with the foot injuries that Kyrie has had, ideally you'd like to see him be able to heal up from those and avoid having to sit, back to backs and things like that, or just games in general for sure.
As we end today's show, the Mavericks get back on the floor on Wednesday night when they welcome in Lauri Markkanen and the Utah Jazz. The Mavericks, of course, 11-8 on the season, losers of 5 of their last 7. Meanwhile, the Utah Jazz 7-13. These are the 2 games against Utah on Wednesday, and then on Friday when they take on the Portland Trailblazers that the Mavericks will play in the middle of the in-season tournament since they did not qualify for the knockout stages in Las Vegas. Lauri Markkanen averaging nearly 24 points per game, shooting over 48% from the field. A young team, Will Hardy, very good coach, getting this young group together and trying to move forward as they grow and develop there. Mavericks going to be in for a long night if they can't defend, because one thing Utah can do, they can find different ways to score. One of the best guys off the bench in the league, throughout the course of his career, Jordan Clarkson, is a guy that can fill it up pretty quickly. So some different things offensively that Utah will present that the Mavericks will have to be able to deal with on Wednesday night when they welcome in Utah in that way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you can also point to the, electric play that they've gotten from their rookie, Keontae George, someone from the Dallas area. He's someone that they'll have to, really kind of work to contain, because he's had some electric, distributing performances to really tie that unit together. And that's something that they've really needed in recent years after, moving on from Donovan Mitchell, is that sort of collective presence to be able to get the most out of the offensive threats. And with Lauri Markkanen, on the perimeter, he's got a high release point. You got to really get out on him. And then, just seeing the battle of young bigs as well with, Walker Kessler and Dereck Lively will be another interesting element to it.
That should be a fun matchup. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to definitely think about for that one. And just, seeing how they kind of snap out of a, losing 5 of the last 7, as you said, that will be important, whether it's a losing team or not. These next couple of games with, when you look a little further ahead to Memphis as a matchup, they literally just lost to Memphis. So you definitely can't take those games lightly, and they're going to have to really get back on track to maintain their seeding in the Western Conference that they've worked. They had a really fantastic start early on and were one of the top teams, and now it's starting to slip a little bit where they're 6th, I believe, before, any further action in the NBA. So that's definitely something they're going to have to make the most of that 3 games coming up for sure.
2 very different extremes for this Utah Jazz team, because you look at their home and road splits, they're 6-4 at home, and they score nearly 120 points per game. On the road, they're just 1-9, and they average 104 points per game. So a team that if you can handle them on the road, the Mavericks will be at home in this game. If they can be tied together defensively, then they'll be able to handle business in that way. But, yeah, Utah, great at home, not very good on the road when it comes to scoring points. And this team, especially when you look at their win-loss record as well, 7-13 on the year, only scoring 108 points per game in their losses this year. So if you can hold them down defensively, you're going to give yourself a pretty good chance, especially with how good this Mavericks team is offensively. But a lot of intriguing players that Utah presents that should be fun to watch on Wednesday when the Mavericks get back on the floor. They'll practice on Tuesday. We'll have much more on that as the rest of the week goes on. Grant, tell the folks so they can find you and what you got going on these days, man.
Yeah, for sure. I have the daily coverage of the Mavs on DallasBasketball.com, the SI Mavs site, and on YouTube as well. I have highlights, press conferences, and I'm going to be doing some video breakdowns, especially that 30-0 run. Definitely to see how that one kind of came together. That won't be a big one as well. But just general things that stand out to me that I find interesting, especially with the mindset of having future implications in the playoffs, like just things that from a day-to-day standpoint. like that Clippers matchup. Like they were really stifled, like on a LA trip in the half court, and the Clippers used ice coverage very effectively 1 through 4. So I'm going to kind of look at some of those things because later on when they play the Clippers again, or if it's a playoff matchup, which has been the case quite often the last couple of years, recently speaking, it's interesting to be able to look back and be like, all right, this is how they handled that in the regular season. This is what caused the problem. So I'll have lots of stuff like that, throughout the season.
You can find me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports, your Mavericks pre- and post-game host on the Dallas Mavericks Radio Network, 97.1 The Freak. Remember, this podcast comes out every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and you can download it on iHeartRadio and wherever you get your podcasts for free, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you give the podcast a 5-star rating, write a review for the podcast while you're there as well. Tell your friends and your family to check out Inside the Mavs, the official Mavericks podcast on 97.1 The Freak. We'll be back on Wednesday to get you ready for the Mavericks taking on the Utah Jazz, and then back on Friday as well to recap everything from that game, as well as get you ready for the Mavericks taking on the Portland Trail Blazers. So a lot to get to this week as the Mavericks are back on the practice floor getting ready for their couple of games this week, and we'll be all over here on Inside the Mavs. That'll do it for our show today. Again, really appreciate you joining us, however, and where you ever be listening to us, whether it be on the podcast or on video as well. You can check out at Kevin Gray Sports on YouTube. You can check out Grant's channel at Grant Afseth. We'll have video clips. And you can also follow the podcast at Inside the Mavs on Twitter. That's Inside the Mavs. Make sure you go give us a follow there as well for show clips, podcast episode drops, videos, and everything else for our podcast. For Grant, I'm Kevin. We'll talk to you on Wednesday here on Inside the Mavs. We'll talk to you later. Peace.